So a worldwide freezing order, a WFO, has just landed on the key figures of the 79th Group. We're talking about David Webster and his sons, Jake and Curtis.
And for anyone who doesn't live in this world, a WFO is. I mean, it's basically the nuclear option in insolvency.
It is a legal sledgehammer, right? It freezes their assets everywhere, globally.
Forces them to disclose everything they own. They have to hand over their passports. It's serious.
Exactly. And when you hear that, your first thought is probably, great, you know, justice served, the assets are finally secured.
Decisive action. Finally.
But our source material on this whole 79th Group collapse, it paints a really a much more unsettling picture.
Definitely.
Because when you actually dig into the timeline of events from the very first red flags to this massive legal move, it starts to look less like timely intervention and more like damage control or, you know, what you might call delayed optics.
And that's the real tension we're getting into today. That's our mission for this deep dive. We're going to walk you through the entire collapse of the 79th Group, which was, I mean, it was just a dizzying financial network.
It's unbelievable.
We are talking about a structure that spanned over 100 companies.
100.
It crossed more than 10 international borders, and it allegedly pulled in over 150 million pounds from investors.
And the administrators they've already called it a Ponzi scheme.
They have, which is why we have to dissect this critical 6-month gap between the professionals getting appointed and this WFO finally being sought. What was the real cost of waiting that long?
Okay, so let's start with just the sheer scale of the alleged fraud, because it's terrifying. We're looking at the latest investor update here from the joint administrators.
Right, that's Andrew Stoneman of Kroll and Jeremy Woodside from 𝐀𝐿.
And this is dated late October 2025. What they uncovered is it's a level of complexity that just seems engineered to confuse people.
It was a true organizational monstrosity. It was built for obfuscation. Think of it like a really dense forest where every single tree is a different company.
And every path is a bank transfer.
Exactly. The investigation found over 100 companies, yes. But to even try to follow the money, they had to track funds across more than 130 bank accounts.
130. Wow.
So this was not a simple single company fraud. It was a vast, tangled web.
But the bottom line, the thing that really matters, is the financial damage. It's over 150 million raised from investors who, you know, they thought they were putting their money into legitimate loan note products. But here's the single most damning fact from that update. The one thing that proves this was structurally fraudulent from the get-go.
This is the key.
The administrators found no assets in the companies that investors were told they were funding.
Zero.
Nothing.
And that finding is just so critical. It proves the cash didn't just disappear because an investment went south, you know, due to bad market conditions.
Right. It wasn't a bad business decision.
No. The sources show the administrators being totally unequivocal here. They said the structure and the fund movements, they're the hallmarks of a UK-based Ponzi scheme.
Hallmarks of a Ponzi scheme.
Yeah. This wasn't a business that hit a rough patch or had a sudden crisis. All the evidence suggests this thing was rotten from the very start.
At that context, the fact that the administrators knew they were walking into a confirmed Ponzi scheme with over 100 companies, that brings us right to the core conflict. How on earth do you square that knowledge with a 6-month delay before you file for the WFO, the single most aggressive tool you have to protect assets?
You can't. It doesn't add up.
Okay, let's unpack this timeline. Because the red flags, I mean, they were flying long before the administrators even showed up.
Way before.
We're going back to October 2022. An industry source, Insolvency and Law, they published content raising huge concerns about the 79th loan note products.
Right, and that content was taken down pretty quickly after they were threatened with defamation.
Of course. But the point is, the early warnings were absolutely out there for anyone who was looking.
Exactly. And the criminal element was already in play. By February 2025, the City of London police were involved.
They'd already raided the Webster's properties.
A formal criminal investigation was already underway. So by the time the administrators Kroll and 𝐀𝐿 were appointed in April and May of 2025, they were walking onto a live crime scene.
Right. April-May 2025 is when Kroll and 𝐀𝐿 get control of the main 79th companies. At the same time, another firm, Grant Thornton, gets appointed over 79th Luxury Living 6.
LL6, a really key investment vehicle in the whole structure.
But the assets were, you know, presumably still moving around.
They were.
Then by June and July, the first proposals are circulated, and this is where the delay just looks awful. It was Grant Thornton, the administrator, over just one piece of this puzzle, who publicly identifies the whole 79th Group as a Ponzi scheme.
In July 2025.
In July. A confirmation that this was a fraud, not just a business failure, was made public months and months ago.
Yet, despite those explicit findings, despite the police investigation, 𝐀𝐝𝐿 and 𝐴𝐴 waited until October 2025 to seek the WFO against David Webster and his sons.
But hang on, if the police have raided properties in February and the administrators know in April that the structure is a total mess,
Yes.
why didn't they just apply for the WFO immediately? Isn't that job number one for an administrator in a suspected fraud? Stop the bad guys from moving the money.
That is the million-pound question,
Yeah.
or in this case, the 150 million-pound question. And it goes right to the heart of their professional duty.
Right.
If preventing asset dissipation, the flight of cash and property,
Right.
was their number one priority, then every single day between May and October was a lost opportunity.
Massive lost opportunity.
The sources, they really emphasize this concern that during that 6-month window, critical opportunities to preserve assets were lost. It's supposed to be a race against time. And it looked like they were still tying their shoes at the starting line.
Which brings us to the formal rules of the game here. When administrators like 𝐀𝐝𝐿 and 𝐴𝐴 take on these appointments, they're not just winging it. They're bound by strict standards.
Yeah, absolutely.
What exactly were they supposed to be doing that might have been, well, compromised by this delay?
They're governed by mandatory standards. The main ones are SIP 2, that's the Statement of Insolvency Practice 2, and the broader Insolvency Code of Ethics.
Okay, so without getting lost in the regulatory weeds, what does SIP 2 actually say?
Think of it as the official rule book for how you're supposed to conduct yourself in a high-stakes insolvency. It's not optional.
And what does that rule book say about speed, about acting fast?
It demands 3 things that are totally non-negotiable in a fraud case: integrity, objectivity, and due care. And crucially, it mandates promptness.
Promptness.
The standard requires that investigations and efforts to realize assets should start as soon as practicable. When you know assets or evidence are at risk, which they absolutely were, given the police were already involved, you must act promptly.
It's not a suggestion.
It's a mandatory obligation. It's designed specifically to protect the creditors, the people who lost their money.
So when you connect that duty back to the timeline, it just creates this powerful tension. I mean, you can argue they needed time to get their heads around the whole 100-company operation.
You can make that argument, sure.
But if your duty is to act as soon as practicable, to stop assets from flying out the door, and another major firm has already publicly called it a Ponzi scheme, how does a 6-month delay possibly square with that idea of promptness?
It creates a serious reputational risk, if nothing else, maybe a legal one down the line. In a case with confirmed fraud, with a live criminal investigation, acting fast is the only way to demonstrate that you're exercising due care and integrity.
Any delay just looks bad.
Exactly. Delays or giving vague updates to creditors, it risks breaching the whole spirit of these duties, especially when the end result is, well, what we have here, a near total loss of recoverable assets.
Which brings us to the devastating practical consequence. What was the real cost of waiting? Here's where the analysis of the assets gets just utterly depressing.
Yeah.
Because the WFO might feel good as a headline, but its actual effect on getting money back is probably minimal after this long a delay.
The administrators basically confirmed the nightmare scenario. They found no recoverable assets in the companies the investors actually put their money into.
So that $150 million was just gone, siphoned off immediately.
Immediately. And what's worse, any actual physical assets that were purchased with that money, property, luxury goods, they were often bought by completely different corporate entities that the Websters also controlled.
Entities that weren't part of the administration.
Exactly. They were totally unrelated to the investment vehicles that 𝐀𝐝𝐿 and 𝐴𝐴 were in charge of, which meant the administrators had to spend months just tracing the money through those 130 bank accounts instead of just, seizing the asset.
So while 𝐀𝐝𝐿 and 𝐴𝐴 were still trying to map the fraud, the Websters had already slipped the cash out the back window. And not only that, they used the assets they did buy as leverage.
Precisely. The sources say many of those acquired assets had already been refinanced. So the Websters took out new loans against the properties.
And gave the security for those loans to brand new third-party lenders.
Exactly. So when the administrators finally show up to look at the properties, they find them, but they're already encumbered. There's already another lender with a claim on them.
So the result is just scraps. The official wording is, very limited, unencumbered assets remain. If they only have scraps left, what good is the worldwide freezing order now?
It can only stop the future movement of those scraps. It gives you a static snapshot of what little is left in October 2025.
It can't go back in time.
Critically, as the sources emphasize, a delayed freezing order cannot reverse prior transfers. It can't undo that refinancing. It can't bring back the cash that was drained away between April and October. It's an effective legal tool that was, you could certainly argue, deployed far too late to do any real good.
Okay, before we get to our final thought, there is one more really fascinating detail in the source material. It suggests that even the administrators themselves weren't really operating as a unified front.
Right.
And that's the really striking absence of Grant Thornton in the WFO action.
This is a significant red flag, I think, when it comes to coordination. Remember, GT was the administrator for LL6.
A critical piece of the puzzle.
A critical piece. And they were the ones who first publicly called this whole thing a Ponzi scheme back in July. They were clearly a primary investigator here.
Yet, the final worldwide freezing order was obtained only by Kroll and 𝐀𝐿. Grant Thornton's name is not on the action.
No. They aren't listed as a party.
Why would that be?
We don't know for sure. But in a case this huge, with assets spread all over the world and across dozens of connected companies, a unified, aggressive front is always the best strategy for chasing down money.
You want everyone pulling in the same direction.
Of course. The statutory duties, integrity, objectivity, promptness, they apply to all the appointed professionals. So GT's absence from this key legal move raises serious questions about coordination, strategy, and unified recovery efforts.
Were they disagreeing on strategy?
Maybe. Or jurisdictional conflicts. We just don't know. But the lack of a joint front is certainly unusual, and it just adds another layer of complexity to this already messy collapse.
For the investor watching all this unfold, the feeling must just be one of intense frustration. The financial destruction happened at lightning speed. But the professional cleanup has been the slow-motion process. The administrators had the authority to act on day one, but the timeline just screams a lack of urgency.
It does.
And the average person who lost their life savings in this, they risk being just a spectator to a slow-motion cleanup, just watching the legal process grind on long after their money has vanished into thin air.
That really sums up the central lesson of this deep dive. Freezing orders and these big, high-profile legal actions, they generate headlines. They give the appearance of decisive intervention.
Right.
But the ultimate impact of that intervention, it's all determined by the timing. This case is a painful illustration that action that looks decisive on paper can be severely limited in its practical effect if it's delayed, especially when you're up against sophisticated fraud actors.
The source material actually ends with a call to action. It specifically urges investors to come forward and share any documents, any correspondence, any bit of evidence they have.
Which is so important.
And this underscores a really crucial insight for you, the learner, to take away. When institutional action is delayed or, perceived as insufficient, maximizing recoveries often comes down to collective creditor action.
It has to.
So the final thought for you to consider is this. When these huge insolvency firms are facing a web of complexity, like the 79th Group, why is the input of every single individual voice, those little documents and emails you might have, why is that so critical to the ultimate success of the investigation?
Because it's often those tiny private pieces of evidence that the administrators need to overcome these huge structural roadblocks. That's what they need to finally build a unified and maybe even a retroactive claim to get some of that money back.
Disclaimer. Insolvency and Law Limited is not a firm of solicitors or licensed insolvency practitioners. We do not conduct any regulated legal or financial activities as defined under the Legal Services Act 2007 or the Financial Services and Markets Act 2000. We do not offer legal advice, financial advice, debt counselling, or conduct litigation. All blogs, podcasts, reports, and other published content by Insolvency and Law are provided solely for general information and educational purposes. They should not be interpreted as a substitute for regulated or professional advice and must not be relied upon as such. For matters that require regulated legal or financial advice, we recommend seeking guidance from an appropriately authorised and regulated professional. Disclaimer. Insolvency and Law Limited is not a firm of solicitors or licensed insolvency practitioners. We do not conduct any regulated legal or financial activities as defined under the Legal Services Act 2007 or the Financial Services and Markets Act 2000. We do not offer legal advice, financial advice, debt counselling, or conduct litigation. All blogs, podcasts, reports, and other published content by Insolvency and Law are provided solely for general information and educational purposes. They should not be interpreted as a substitute for regulated or professional advice and must not be relied upon as such. For matters that require regulated legal or financial advice, we recommend seeking guidance from an appropriately authorised and regulated professional.